The best way to understand Mark Zuckerberg is to forget. For a moment, the global empire Facebook became the billions of users, the acquisitions, the controversies, the congressional hearings, and go back to who he was before any of that existed. When you study his early years through books like The Facebook Effect, David G. Kirkpatrick's reporting, Sarah Fryer's No Filter, and dozens of interviews with the people who built Facebook alongside him, you begin to see a young man who wasn't trying to build a company. He was trying to decode human behavior, map the dynamics of social interaction, and turn the psychology of connection into code. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe, because every week we break down the minds of history's greatest builders and extract the principles you and I can apply today. Now, let's rewind. Long before he became a tech CEO, Zuckerberg was a kid in Dobbs Ferry, New York, who loved two things: programming and people. That combination may sound strange because Zuckerberg's public persona is famously awkward, robotic, and introverted. But the secret, the part most people miss, is that he wasn't socially clueless. He was socially analytical. He studied human interactions the same way a researcher studies a new species. He observed group behavior, microstatus shifts, social dynamics, emotional signals, and then he built software to test what he observed. Even in high school, this pattern appears. His early projects weren't games or utilities. They were tools that played with social information. He built a version of Spotify before Spotify existed, recommending music based on user preference patterns. He built a messaging system for his dad's dental office. He built early prototypes of what we would now call social graphs, ways of organizing people, interests, identity, and relevance. Every project was an experiment in human predictive modeling. When he arrived at Harvard, everything accelerated. The campus was a petri dish of social hierarchy, cliques, dorm tribes, social clubs, rivalries, romances, and microcultures. And Zuckerberg didn't just live inside that environment. He dissected it. While most students were worried about classes, internships, and dating, Zuckerberg was mapping human behavior with the same intensity. A scientist maps neural pathways. This is where the myth and the reality collide. Yes, he built FaceMast, the infamous hot or not site that compared stews and photos, and yes, it got him in trouble. But people misunderstand what he was doing. It wasn't about attractiveness. It was about social ranking, feedback loops, virality, and rapid response behavior. He wanted to see how people would react when given a chance to compare, vote, refresh, validate, and judge in hell chimie. The experiment got 22,000 page views in 2 hours. It was crude, but it revealed something huge. People were addicted to seeing reflections of themselves through the opinions of others. That insight becomes the DNA of Facebook. Zuckerberg realized that identity, validation, comparison, aspiration, belonging, these psychological drivers are universal. And more importantly, they can be... He understood that human behavior is predictable when the right incentives and feedback loops exist. So instead of trying to build a website, he built a psychological mirror, a place where every user could watch themselves through the eyes of their community. And the moment he launched the Facebook in February 2004, the reaction confirmed what he already suspected. People aren't connecting online because of technology. People are connecting online because technology amplifies instincts that have existed for thousands of years. That is the real beginning of Facebook, not as a company, but as a behavioral experiment. When the Facebook launched inside Harvard, something fascinating happened. It didn't spread like a product. It spread like gossip. Students didn't share it because it was useful. They shared it because it allowed them to see and be seen. They were suddenly able to track relationships, friendships, rivalries, dorm identities, and subtle social rules that had always existed but were previously invisible. Zuckerberg didn't just build a website. He exposed the underlying psychological skeleton of college life, and that's why it exploded. What people forget is that Zuckerberg did not market the Facebook. He didn't have to. Human behavior did the marketing for him. Students logged in compulsively because they finally had a digital reflection of their social universe. In fact, several early users told Kirkpatrick that the first time they opened Facebook, they spent hours clicking through profiles. Not because the platform offered features, but because it offered understanding. It gave them insight into people they could never openly ask about. That was Zuckerberg's entire philosophy. If you understand human behavior, you never have to guess what people want. You already know the speed of Facebook's expansion became a kind of psychological study in itself. Yale, Columbia, Stanford, each new campus reacted exactly like Harvard. Users joined not because Zuckerberg invited them, but because they feared being left out of a new social hierarchy that was forming online. FOMO wasn't invented by Facebook, but Facebook industrialized it. And Zuckerberg understood that dynamic instinctively. His obsession with behavior wasn't just academic, it shaped every major design decision. Early Facebook didn't allow pseudonyms. Zuckerberg insisted on real names because in the real world, identity shapes accountability. If people feel anonymous, they behave differently. If they are known, they play by social norms. He wasn't building a random message board. He was building a digital society, a place where real identity, real networks, and real consequences produced real behavior. And here's the brilliant part. Zuckerberg didn't build many features at all. He built almost nothing. Facebook in 2004 had profiles, relationship status, photos, and a few basic fields. That's it. But each element was chosen precisely because it activated universal psychological triggers. Relationship status triggered curiosity, jealousy, and validation. Photos triggered comparison and microstatus negotiation. Friend lists triggered belonging and social proof. Nothing was random. Everything was based on behavioral mechanisms older than civilization itself. Even the poke button, which seems like a joke now, was one of the most revealing features ever launched on a social platform. Why? Because Zuckerberg wanted to observe what people would do with a social action that had no explicit meaning. Would they flirt, tease, anoint, signal interest, create inside jokes? He wanted to see how people invented meaning when given a blank behavioral tool. And he was right. People turned it into everything. The further you look into Facebook's early choices, the clearer it becomes that Zuckerberg wasn't reverse engineering technology. He was reverse engineering people. He built features that activated instincts we don't acknowledge openly but follow subconsciously. The desire for attention, the need for belonging, the curiosity about others, and the hunger to be seen not just as we are, but as we wish to be. By the time Facebook expanded beyond universities, Zuckerberg already knew something the rest of Silicon Valley was slow to understand. Humans behave predictably at scale, and if you can model the behavior of 1,000 students, you can model the behavior of 1 billion users. And that is exactly what he set out to do next. As Facebook broke out of the college ecosystem and entered the open world, Zuckerberg faced a challenge that would have destroyed most founders. The psychological patterns he had mastered inside universities needed to scale to the entire human population. And yet, the same instincts he had analyzed in dorm rooms: identity, status, connection, curiosity, self-presentation, turned out to be universal. What changed was not the psychology. What changed was the intensity. When Facebook opened to high schools, then companies, and finally everyone, Zuckerberg began operating more like a behavioral economist than a programmer. He paid close attention to how people revealed themselves online, how they managed their identities, how they competed for attention, and how groups formed, dissolved, and reformed. Every data point was a clue. Every user click was a signal, and every new feature became a behavioral experiment running at planetary scale. One of the clearest examples of this is the newsfeed. When Facebook launched it in 2006, people were outraged. They felt exposed, surveilled, overly visible, but Zuckerberg wasn't surprised by the backlash. He predicted it. He knew that humans always react poorly when their social behavior becomes suddenly transparent. But he also knew something deeper. Once users realized that transparency helped them gain attention, validate identity, and track others, they would accept it. And within weeks, they did. Zuckerberg had seen this pattern before in Miniature Forum at Harvard. When behavior becomes easier to observe, people first panic, then adapt, then depend on it. The newsfeed was not a technological invention. It was a behavioral bed end that worked. Another important moment came when Facebook introduced the like button in 2009. On the surface, it looked like a simple shortcut for positive feedback. In reality, it was one of the most powerful psychological triggers ever deployed online. The like button turned social interaction into a measurable reward system. It quantified validation, it made attention visible, competitive, addictive, and because Zuckerberg had studied how people chase microapproval, He knew the button would become a feedback loop people returned to again and again. From there, Facebook transformed into something more than a platform. It became a behavioral engine. The company began analyzing patterns of interaction the way scientists analyze natural ecosystems, detecting how emotions spread, how opinions echo, how social norms evolve online. Zuckerberg himself spoke openly about wanting to map the social graph of humanity, a phrase lifted almost directly from behavioral research. And in a way, that's exactly what he did. Facebook collected enough data about human connection to become the most detailed behavioral model ever created. Throughout this period, Zuckerberg operated with a single guiding belief. If you understand how people behave, you can predict what they will want before they ask for it. He was building not just a product, but a machine that anticipated human desire. And as the platform grew to hundreds of millions of users, a new pattern emerged, one that would define the next era of Facebook's. As Facebook scaled into the hundreds of millions, Zuckerberg began making decisions that didn't look like business strategy. They looked like anthropology. He was no longer observing how people behaved in isolated social circles. He was observing how humans behaved as a species. And this is where his work becomes far more ambitious, almost philosophical. Because once Facebook had enough users, Zuckerberg could see something that almost no one in history had ever seen before: real-time patterns of global human behavior. He could watch friendships form across continents, see political ideas spread across cultures, observe how emotions move through networks like weather systems. He began treating Facebook as if it were a living organism, a social brain with billions of neurons firing every second. This is the moment where the shift happens. Zuckerberg realizes that if Facebook is going to survive, it cannot simply reflect human behavior. It must shape it, not through manipulation, but through structure. The better the structure, the more predictable the behavior. And the more predictable the behavior, the more scalable the platform. That's why he made one of the most important decisions in Facebook's entire history. He pushed the company toward mobile long before competitors understood what that meant. Zuckerberg saw early behavioral data showing that people pick up their phones dozens of times a day, not because they need information, but because they crave micro moments of connection, distraction, validation, and social presence. He recognized that Facebook had to fit into that instinct or be replaced by something that did. His leadership team argued the mobile app was slow, unstable, difficult to rewrite, and Facebook's web product was still thriving. But Zuckerberg didn't care. He didn't follow revenue curves. He followed behavioral curves. When he realized that people were shifting their social lives into the quiet, repetitive rhythm of mobile interaction, he ordered the company to rebuild everything, even if it meant breaking what already worked. Engineers later said it was one of the most painful transitions in the company's history, but also the most important. It locked Facebook into the fabric of daily human behavior by aligning the platform with the device people carried closest to their emotions. And then came what was arguably Zuckerberg's most psychologically informed acquisition, Instagram. The world thought he bought Instagram to eliminate a competitor, but if you read Sarah Fryer's No Filter or the internal memos written at the time, you see something deeper. Zuckerberg understood that Instagram wasn't just a photo-sharing app. It was an identity publishing platform, a place where people crafted personas, shaped narratives, and projected aspiration. It allowed users to build carefully edited versions of themselves, something Facebook had never executed with the same elegance. He didn't buy Instagram to win a market. He bought it to understand and internalize a new form of human self. This was Zuckerberg's real superpower. He saw platforms not as products, but as mirrors. Each one reflected a different layer of human behavior. Facebook reflected connection, Instagram reflected identity, and he knew the next frontier would reflect something else, something more immersive, something that required an entirely different medium. And that insight is exactly what leads to the next evolution of his career, as Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp grew into a global ecosystem. Zuckerberg realized something profound. Human behavior wasn't just shifting to digital platforms, it was fusing with them. People were no longer visiting the internet. They were living inside it. And once again, he followed the behavioral pattern before the market saw it. He understood that the next frontier of social technology wouldn't be two-dimensional feeds or static profiles. It would be immersive environments where identity, presence, and interaction feel as real as physical life. This wasn't guesswork. It came from years of observing how people behaved online. When users posted photos, They weren't just sharing memories, they were crafting identities. When they used Messenger, they weren't just talking, they were maintaining social bonds. When they scrolled endlessly, they weren't bored, they were responding to deep psychological cravings for novelty and social relevance. And when short-form video exploded, Zuckerberg saw it not as a trend, but as proof that humans crave dynamic emotional stimuli, not just information. That's why he shifted the entire company toward the concept of the metaverse. Most of the world mocked the decision. Investors panicked. Commentators laughed. Headlines called it delusional. But to Zuckerberg, it wasn't a bet on VR headsets or virtual avatars. It was a continuation of the same fundamental question he had been obsessed with since Harvard. How do humans behave when given a new social environment? And what will they do if that environment feels real? The metaverse wasn't a product pitch. It was a behavioral hypothesis. If people already express identity through photos, if they already maintain relationships through screens, if they already project curated versions of themselves online, then what happens when the digital self becomes embodied in 3D space? For Zuckerberg, the answer was obvious. The next generation would adopt it naturally, the same way past generations adopted social media. He believed that digital presence would evolve from text to images to video to full spatial experience. And that belief wasn't rooted in futurism, it was rooted in behavioral continuity. The same insight drove his push into AI. While the public saw chatbots and image generators as novelties, Zuckerberg saw something different. He saw a new layer of human behavior forming a relationship between individuals and non-human entities that could understand, respond, and even adapt to emotional cues. He saw people turning to AI for reassurance, creativity, guidance, companionship, validation, and he recognized that any platform controlling the future of identity and social interaction had to control AI as well. This is where Zuckerberg's behavioral intuition becomes impossible to ignore. Over and over again, across 2 decades, he didn't just follow what people said they wanted. He followed what their behavior revealed they would eventually want, even before they knew it themselves. He never saw Facebook as a tech company. He saw it as a constantly evolving psychological organism, one that needed to anticipate human emotions, not just mirror them. At this point in the story, a question becomes unavoidable. How does someone so analytical, so emotionally distant on the surface, understand human behavior so deeply? The answer appears when you look at the final and most misunderstood part of his personality. To understand the final layer of how Zuckerberg built Facebook, the part people misunderstand most, you have to look past the hoodie, the monotone voice, the robotic posture, the engineer stereotype, because underneath all of that is someone who paradoxically understands human behavior, precisely because he sits slightly outside of it. Nearly every biography, from the Facebook effect to No Filter to An Ugly Truth, repeats the same pattern. Zuckerberg is an observer first, a participant second. He doesn't behave like most people, so he watches them instead. He studies their reactions. He analyzes their hierarchies. He sees emotional patterns the way a mathematician sees equations. While others get swept up in social dynamics, he dissects them with distance and clarity. And that distance is his advantage. Where most founders build products they personally want, Zuckerberg built products based on what billions of people would want, even if he didn't feel those impulses himself. His detachment became a lens. He could see how people chased validation, sought belonging, negotiated identity, competed for attention, shaped narratives, and revealed themselves through micro-behaviors long before Silicon Valley recognized those patterns. This is why his strategic decisions often seemed cold or controversial. To him, they weren't moral dilemmas, they were behavioral inevitabilities. If you give people a space to express themselves, they will. If you give them public metrics of validation, they will chase them. If you connect them into large networks, emotions will spread faster than facts. If you optimize for engagement, the extreme will outperform the moderate. Zuckerberg didn't create these instincts. He revealed them. And this is where the story becomes larger than Facebook. Because what Zuckerberg built wasn't just a company. It wasn't just a platform. It wasn't just a network. He built a behavioral infrastructure for the modern world. Facebook rewired how people communicate, compete, date, argue, perform, compare, and even think. Instagram reshaped identity and aspiration. WhatsApp redefined intimacy and global connection. Messenger groups, stories, marketplace, and reels. Each one corresponds to a different human instinct, and all of them are built on the same foundational principle. Study what people do, not what they say. Zuckerberg's legacy, whether one admires or criticizes him, is unavoidably tied to this core truth. He did not become powerful by understanding technology. He became powerful by understanding people. He built Facebook by decoding behavior the same way scientists decode genomes. He saw that humans are predictable when placed in certain social environments, and he built environments where those predictions became reality. The final insight is this: Zuckerberg didn't harness human behavior. Human behavior harnessed Facebook. The platform became a reflection of us, our needs, our ego, our envy, our longing, our flaws, our humor, our tribes, our fears. He didn't invent any of it. He amplified all of it, and that is how he built one of the most transformational and controversial platforms in history. Not through luck, not through genius alone, but through an unblinking, analytical understanding of what drives us beneath the surface. When you follow his decisions across 2 decades, the lesson becomes clear. To build something at the scale of Facebook, you don't need to predict the future. You need to understand the past, the instincts that shaped us, the behaviors we can't escape, and the psychological patterns that show up everywhere humans gather. Zuckerberg didn't guess those patterns. He measured them, he mapped them, and he built an empire on top of them.